Python 3.11 is coming out very soon. In it, CPython claimed to be 10 to 60% faster. How did you pull that off? And what's CPython?
CPython is the last Python implementation standing, also the first one that was ever created. The original Python implementation that I started over 30 years ago.
So what does it mean that Python, the programming language, is implemented in another programming language called C?
What kind of audience do you have in mind here? People who know programming?
No, there's somebody on a boat that's into fishing and have never heard about programming, but also some world-class programmers. So you're going to have to speak to both. Imagine a boat with two people. One of them has not heard about programming and is really into fishing, and the other one is like an incredible Silicon Valley programmer that's programmed in everything. C, C++, Python, Rust, Java. He knows the entire history of programming languages, so you're going to have to speak to both.
I imagine that boat in the middle of the ocean.
Yes.
I'm going to please the guy who knows how to fish first.
Yes, please. He seems like the most useful in the middle of the ocean. You got to make him happy.
I'm sure he has a cell phone, so he's probably very suspicious about what goes on in that cell phone, but he must have heard that inside a cell phone is a tiny computer. And a programming language is computer code that tells the computer what to do.
It's a very low level language. It's zeros and ones, and then there's assembly, and then...
Oh, yeah, but we don't talk about these really low levels because those just confuse people. I mean, when we're talking about human language, we're not usually talking about vocal tracts and how you position your tongue. I was talking yesterday about how when you have a Chinese person and they speak English, this is a bit of a stereotype. They often don't know, or they can't seem to make the difference well between an L and an R. Mm-hmm. And I have a theory about that, and I've never checked this with linguists, that it probably has to do with the fact that in Chinese there is not really a difference, and it could be that there are regional variations in how native Chinese speakers pronounce that one sound that sounds to L to some, like L to some of them, like R to others.
So it's both the sounds you produce with your mouth throughout the history of your life and what you're used to listening to. I mean, every language has that. Russian has...
Exactly.
The Slavic languages have sounds like zh, the letter zh. Like Americans or English speakers don't seem to know the sound zh, zh. They seem uncomfortable with that sound.
Yeah.
So yes, okay. So we're not going to the shapes of tongues and the sounds that the mouth can make. Fine.
And
words.
Similarly, we're not going into the ones and zeros or machine language. I would say a programming language is a list of instructions like a cookbook recipe that sort of tells you how to do a certain thing. Like make a sandwich. Well, acquire a loaf of bread, cut it in slices. Take 2 slices, put mustard on one, put jelly on the other or something, then add the meat, then add the cheese. Mm-hmm. I've heard that science teachers can actually do great stuff with recipes like that and trying to interpret their students' instructions incorrectly until the students are completely unambiguous about it.
With language, see, that's the difference between natural languages and programming languages. I think ambiguity is a feature, not a bug in human spoken languages. Like, that's the dance of communication between humans.
Well, for lawyers, ambiguity certainly is a feature. For plenty of other cases, the ambiguity is not much of a feature, but we work around it, of course. Well, what's more important is context.
So with context, the precision of the statement becomes more and more concrete, right? But, when you say, I love you to a person that matters a lot to you, the person doesn't try to compile that statement and return an error saying, please define love, right?
No, but I imagine that my wife and my son interpret it very differently.
Yes.
Even though it's the same 3 words.
But imprecisely still.
Oh, for sure.
Lawyers would have a
Never,
lot of follow-up questions for you.
nevertheless, the context is already different in that case.
Yes, fair enough. So that's a programming language, is ability to unambiguously state a recipe. Actually, let's go back. Let's go to PEP 8. You go through in PEP 8, the style guide for Python code, some ideas of what this language should look like, feel like, read like. And the big idea there is that code readability counts. What does that mean to you? And how do we achieve it? So this recipe should be readable.
That's a thing between programmers. Because on the one hand, we always explain the concept of programming language as computers need instructions, and computers are very dumb and they need very precise instructions because they don't have much context. In fact, they have lots of context, but their context is very different. But what we've seen emerge during the development of software, starting probably in the late 40s, is that software is a very social activity. A software developer is not a mad scientist who sits alone in his lab writing brilliant code. Software is developed by teams of people. Even the mad scientist sitting alone in his lab can type fast enough to produce enough code so that by the time he's done with his coding, he still remembers what the first few lines he wrote mean. Mm-hmm. So even the mad scientist coding alone in his lab would be sort of wise to adopt conventions on how to format the instructions that he gives to the computer. So that the thing is, there is a difference between a cookbook recipe and a computer program. The cookbook recipe, the author of the cookbook writes it once, and then it's printed in 100,000 copies. And then lots of people in their kitchens try to recreate that recipe, that particular pie or dish from the recipe. And so there, the goal of the cookbook author is to make it clear to the human reader of the recipe, the human amateur chef in most cases. When you're writing a computer program, you have two audiences at once. It needs to tell the computer what to do, but it also is useful if that program is readable by other programmers. Because computer software, unlike the typical recipe for a cherry pie, is so complex that you don't get all of it right at once. You end up with the activity of debugging, and you end up with the activity of... So debugging is trying to figure out why your code doesn't run the way you thought it should run.
That means broadly, it could be stupid little errors, or it could be big logical errors.
It could be anything
spiritual.
It could be anything from a typo to a wrong choice of algorithm to building something that does what you tell it to do, but that's not useful.
Yeah, it seems to work really well 99% of the time, but does weird things 1% of the time on some edge cases.
That's pretty much all software nowadays.
All good software, right?
Well, yeah, for bad software,
that 99 goes down a lot. So, but it's not just about the complexity of the program. It's like you said, it is a social endeavor in that you're constantly improving that recipe for the cherry pie.
But you're in a group of people improving that recipe. Or the mad scientist is improving the recipe that he created a year ago and making it better. Or adding something. He decides that he wants he wants some decoration on his pie or icing or...
So there's broad philosophical things and there's specific advice on style. So first of all, the thing that people first experience when they look up Python, it is very readable, but there's also like a spatial structure to it. Can you explain the indentation style of Python and what is the magic to it?
Spaces are important for readability of any kind of text. If you take a cookbook recipe and you remove all the bullets and other markup, and you just crunch all the text together, maybe you leave the spaces between the words, but that's all you leave. When you're in the kitchen trying to figure out, what are the ingredients and what are the steps, and where does this step end and the next step begin, you're going to have a hard time if it's just one solid block of text. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what a typical cookbook does, if the paper is not too expensive, each recipe starts on its own page. Maybe there's a picture next to it. The list of ingredients comes first. There's a standard notation. There's shortcuts so that you don't have to sort of write 2 sentences on how you have to cut the onion, because there are only 3 ways that people ever cut onions in a kitchen: small, medium, and in slices, or something like that.
Right.
None of my examples make any sense to real cooks, of course, but
yeah. We're talking to programmers with a metaphor of cooking. I love it. But there is a strictness to the spacing that Python defines. So there's some looser things, some stricter things, but the 4 spaces for the indentation is really interesting. It really defines what the language looks and feels like.
Because indentation, sort of taking a block of text and then having inside that block of text a smaller block of text that is indented further as sort of a group. It's like you have a bulleted list in a complex business document, and inside some of the bullets are other bulleted lists. You will indent those too. Mm-hmm. If each bulleted list is indented several inches, then at 2 levels deep, there's no space left on the page to put any of the words of the text. Mm-hmm. So you can't indent too far. On the other hand, if you don't indent at all, you can tell whether something is a top-level bullet or a second-level bullet or a third-level bullet. So you have to have some compromise. And based on ancient conventions and the typical width of a computer screen in the 80s, and all sorts of things, we came up with 4 spaces as a compromise. I mean, there are groups, there are large groups of people who code with 2 spaces per indent level. For example, the Google Style Guide, all the Google Python code, and I think also all the Google C++ code is indented with only 2 spaces per block. If you're not used to that, it's harder to, at a glance, understand the code, because the high level structure is determined by the indentation. On the other hand, there are other programming languages where the indentation is 8 spaces or a whole tab stop in sort of classic Unix. And to me, that looks weird, because you after 3 indent levels, you've got no room left.
Well, there's some languages where the indentation is a recommendation. It's a stylistic one. The code compiles even without any indentation. And then Python, really, indentation is a fundamental part of the language, right?
It doesn't have to be 4 spaces. So you can code Python with 2 spaces per block, or 6 spaces, or 12 if you really want to go wild. But sort of everything that belongs to the same block needs to be indented the same way. In practice, in most other languages, people recommend doing that anyway. If you look at C or Rust or C++, all those languages, Java, don't have a requirement of indentation, but except in extreme cases, they're just as anal about having their code properly indented.
So any IDE that the syntax highlighting that works with Java or C++, they will yell at you aggressively if you don't do proper indentation.
They'd suggest the proper indentation for you. Like in C, you type a few words, and then you type a curly brace, which there is their notion of sort of begin an indented block.
Yep.
Then you hit return, and then it automatically indents 4 or 8 spaces, depending on your style preferences or how your editor is configured.
Was there a possible universe in which you considered having braces in Python?
Absolutely, yeah.
What was it, 60-40, 70-30 in your head? What was the trade-off?
For a long time, I was actually convinced that the indentation was just better. Without context, I would still claim that indentation is better. It reduces clutter. However, as I started to say earlier, context is almost everything. And in the context of coding, most programmers are familiar with multiple languages, even if they're only good at one or two.
Hmm.
And apart from Python and maybe Fortran, I don't know how that's written these days anymore, but all the other languages, Java, Rust, C, C++, JavaScript, TypeScript, Perl, are all using curly braces to sort of indicate blocks. And so Python is the odd one out.
So it's a radical idea. Do you still, as a radical renegade revolutionary, do you still stand behind this idea of indentation versus braces? Like what can you dig into it a little bit more? Why you still stand behind indentation?
Because context is not the whole story. History, in a sense, provides more context. So for Python, there's no chance that we can switch. Python is using curly braces for something else, dictionaries mostly. Mm-hmm. We would get in trouble if we wanted to switch. Just like you couldn't redefine C to use indentation, even if you agree that indentation sort of in a greenfield environment would be better. You can't change that kind of thing in a language.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to reach agreement over much more minor details. Maybe, I mean, in the past in Python, we did have a big debate about tabs versus spaces and 4 spaces versus fewer or more. And we sort of came up with a recommended standard and sort of options for people who want to be different.
But yes, I guess the thought experiment I'd like you to consider is if you could travel back through time when the compatibility is not an issue and you started Python all over again, can you make the case for indentation still?
Well, it frees up a pair of matched brackets, of which there are never enough in the world, for other purposes. It really makes the language slightly sort of easier to grasp for people who don't already know another programming language. Because the sort of one of the things, and I mostly got this from my mentors who taught me programming language design in the earlier 80s. When you're teaching programming for the total newbie who has not coded before, not in any other language, a whole bunch of concepts in programming are very alien or sort of new and maybe very interesting, but also distracting and confusing. And there are many different things you have to learn. You have to sort of, in a typical 13-week programming course, you have to, if it's like really learning to program from scratch, you have to cover algorithms, you have to cover data structures, you have to cover syntax, you have to cover variables, loops, functions, recursion, classes, expressions, operators. There are so many concepts. If you can spend a little less time having to worry about the syntax. The classic example was often, oh, the compiler complains every time I put a semicolon in the wrong place or I forget to put a semicolon. Python doesn't have semicolons in that sense. So you can't forget them. And you are also not sort of misled into putting them where they don't belong because you don't learn about them in the first place.
The flip side of that is forcing the strictness onto the beginning programmer to teach them that programming is values attention to details. You don't get to just write the way you write an English
plenty
paper.
of other details that they have
Yes.
to pay attention to.
Yes.
So I think they'll still get the message about paying attention to detail.